Want me?
All right, hi everybody. Good evening. Beautiful day out there. Thank you all for coming tonight. We have the most talented Kim Eierman here, and I'm going to let Jen Kretzer introduce Kim after I'm done here. But my name is Brittany Christensen, and I'm the Executive Director of ADK Action. And we created the Pollinator Project in 2016, and that was in response to the Pollinator Protection Plan that New York State put out. And when that plan came out, Marcia Stanley, whom many of you in the audience are friends with, said, you know what, we really should expand our Monarch project to include all pollinators. And I had been thinking the same thing at about the same time, so we decided to design the Pollinator Project. And we brought together some fantastic partners. You see them all up here, Land Conservancy, Wild Center, and Paul Smith College. And then we also have some great sponsors, Scott's Florist, the Garden Club of Lake Placid, Cook and Gardner Nursery, who, for those of you that participated in our plant sale, grew almost 700 neonicotinoid-free plants for us so that we could help people plant pollinator gardens that we knew would be healthy for the bees and the butterflies and the other pollinators. And then we also have Design by the Yard as a sponsor, and that's Marcia's personal landscaper. So we're a great group of people, a good team. We're working all over the Adirondack Park to inspire people to take action to help pollinators thrive. We're doing that by giving out free pollinator seeds. If you haven't gotten some already, there's some at the booth right outside. The seed packets that we're giving out have 27 different varieties of wildflower seeds, so grab some of those. We're also putting on events like this one here today. We're doing some film showings. There's a film called Rusty Patch, a Ghost in the Making, and we're showing that at the Wild Center every day all summer, as well as about 6 other locations in the park. And that film is wonderful. I hope you get the chance to check it out. We also have another lecture later this summer. Karen Oberhauser will be here on August 10th. And Kim Eierman has actually,
I've interviewed her, on my website,
Kim has a great interview with Karen on her website. And Karen Oberhauser is one of the top 3 monarch scientists in the world, and she really focuses on monarchs and climate change. So anyhow, we're coming out with tons of programming around pollinators, really trying to, heighten the collective awareness. And thank you very much for being here tonight.
Hi everyone, it's so nice to look out into the crowd and see so many friendly faces. Welcome to the Wild Center and our evening lecture tonight. The Wild Center has been a part of the Pollinator Project for a while now. Many of you know we did a lot of stuff with the monarch butterflies and hosted many great lectures here, and we're also doing programming. And I have to say, after watching the Rusty Patch film, some staff and I are like, I think we need to spend the summer looking for that bumblebee, because it used to have a range up here in the Adirondacks, and I like to think that maybe somewhere still is buzzing around. So we're really pleased tonight with tonight's lecture. Kim Eierman is an environmental horticulturalist specializing in ecological landscapes and native plants based in New York. Kim teaches at the New York Botanical Garden, Brooklyn Botanical Garden, the Native Plant Center in New York, Rutgers Home Gardeners School, and several other institutions. Kim is an active speaker nationwide on many ecological landscape topics, presenting for industry conferences, green events, master gardener groups, garden clubs, nature centers, Audubon Society chapters, beekeeping groups, and other organizations interested in environmental improvements. That's great, because we are one of those. We are definitely one of those places, and I know everyone here is pretty excited about this. Kim also provides horticultural consulting to homeowners and commercial clients. In addition to being a certified horticulturalist through the American Society of Horticultural Science, Kim is an accredited organic land care professional, a steering committee member of the Native Plant Center, and a member of the Ecological Landscape Alliance and the Garden Writers Association. She was awarded the Silver Medal of Achievement by the Garden Writers Association for their 2014, 2015, and 2017 Media Awards program. So please welcome Kim.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
How's the volume? Is the volume good? Everybody can hear me pretty well? Well, thank you so much for coming. I think we need to actually get us on the screen here. I don't know how to do that. I can talk about bees, but I can't do that. So I live in Westchester County, New York. Anybody originally from Westchester? Anybody ever spent any time in Westchester? Highly developed area, right? Very concentrated landscapes. And, you know, sometimes we think, what is it that we can do individually that'll make any difference? And I can tell you from personal experience, the answer is a lot. I live on less than 1/5 of an acre in Bronxville, New York. I am 16 miles north of Midtown Manhattan. And when I plant it, they come. So if that's not inspiration for all of us, I don't know what is. So I'm going to ask you guys a question to open this talk. What is that flower, and what is that bee? And anybody who works, and by the way, I do want to thank ADK Action and the Wild Center and the Lake Placid Land Conservancy as well, before I forget. So you guys can't answer the question, because you know. So what's that flower? What's that bee? Come on. Come on, you get a, think spring, early spring, there's something in bloom, it's so beautiful. How about maple, red maple? Right, that's red maple flower, a really important source of nectar and pollen for early emerging bees. Now, of course, that's a honeybee, that is not one of our native bees, and we don't mind feeding them too with our native plants. They're going to be active when the temperature is 50 degrees or higher, but there's some of our tough native bees that can withstand cold temperatures and rainy climates, like our bumblebees, that'll come out early, and they're looking for forage resources. So your first tip for the evening is to start thinking about the early blooming trees and shrubs that will support the early emerging bees that are often really desperate to find resources. Can anybody name, other than, you know, my ringers, anybody name another plant in the early spring that you've seen bees on? Not so, a European weed, but thank you for that. Dandelion. How about pussy willows? How about any of our native willows? Very, very valuable, very, very important for bees. So the first thing is we've got to start thinking kind of outside the box in terms of how we support pollinators. And how important are pollinators? Well, they're really important, but so are all invertebrate species pretty much. And we have an enormous decline globally. In the past 40 years, we've seen about a 45% decline in invertebrate species populations. Now, why would bugs be important? I bet there's some exhibits here that'll tell you that. Why would bugs be important in our ecosystems? They're protein, they're food, right? They're protein, they're food for lots of birds and for lots of other critters. For example, foxes will eat insects when they really need a good protein snack. It's a lot easier sometimes than catching a mouse, for example. So invertebrates are important, and pollinators are a subset, but they're all really at risk. I thought about the Victory Gardens from World War II. Remember hearing about the Victory Gardens? Americans were encouraged to garden for food defense by creating a backyard. They didn't have the nerve to do front yard gardens back in those days, but a backyard garden for food defense. So I thought, well, isn't it kind of time that we think about pollinator victory gardens for pollinator defense? And this is why. Does that look familiar to you? Not so much around here. Do you see very much of that around this beautiful area? I saw some of it driving around. You know, we've kind of inherited this notion that lawn is what we should have. Michael Pollen wrote about this in his book, Second Nature, in like 1999. If you've ever read that book, it's a wonderful book. And he said, you know, we kind of took the lawn that was the purview of the rich In England, on the manor houses, right, they had these maintained landscapes. They'd bring in the sheep or the goats and then eventually equipment to maintain it. But it was a way to control nature. But we brought it overseas and we democratized it. And it just kind of flows from one lawn, one neighbor, to another, to another, to another. And we don't even know why we do it. It's become a cultural norm. And I think arguably this is the one most important thing that we need to change, is reducing or eliminating, I'll just say it right up, the green desert. That's what I call it. It's an ecological wasteland. But most of our landscapes kind of look like this, with the big old green deserts, and the more perfect they look, probably the more synthetic pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, you know, various different things we put on them to make them look that good. But that landscape has some meatball plants that are pruned into shapes that nature can't recognize or use very easily. And the ones I really like are the ones that are twisted. I hope nobody has those at home. You know, the ones that are like the twisted, tortured little plants. And then we have a few overstory trees, and that's about it. And this is what most of our landscapes look like from coast to coast. I've seen them. I went to Portland, Oregon a few years back, and my friend told me, gosh, you know, Portland's really green. They're really environmental. They have a great environmental conscience. And I saw tons of this. So we can start making a change right here at home. And I want you to do that. I want you to start thinking about floral resources, but also habitat for bees. So how important are pollinators? Well, depending on the source that you refer to, pollinators, animal pollinators as a big group, are responsible for 75 to 80% of the reproduction of all flowering plants on Earth. That's pretty enormous. And about a third of our food crops. I think Whole Foods has co-opted this information. You know, 1/3, you know, 1 out of 3 bites of food that you eat is pollinated by an animal. And even with some of the crops that don't require animal pollination, we can have increased yield. I've got a really interesting, my website, Eco-Beneficial, name of my company, I do some really interesting interviews with fascinating people. And I interviewed a fellow by the name of John Hayden, who has a farm, a fruit farm called The Farm Between in Vermont. Don't ask me which town it's in. I know it's near. Thank you, thank you. Have you seen my video with John? Okay. So in any case, he talks about growing fruit and trying to really bring more native bees into the landscape to increase his production. He's doing some really cool things. He's building bee habitat that's kind of a bit of a riff on permaculture practice of hugelkultur. Have you ever heard of that, where they build mounds of debris and then actually plant into them? It's a principle of permaculture. Well, he's taken that notion and he's building bee habitat like that to bring the bees in, because he knows, as you now know, that bees and other pollinators need not only floral resources, flowers, they need habitat too. And pollinators, including bees, are part of the larger food web. They get eaten by other creatures. Who has read Doug Tallamy's book, Dr. Doug Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home? Come on, you guys, really? This guy's brilliant. No? Entomologist from University of Delaware. He's a lepidopterist. He specializes in butterfly skippers and moths. And I'd say there are 3 people in my lifetime who've written books that have changed my perspective, at least personally, on how we look at our landscapes. One, Rachel Carlson, right? In 1962. I was alive then. That gives you an idea how old I am. Really important book. We're still spraying pesticides all these years later. Number 2, Sarah Stein, brilliant author and gardener in Westchester County, of all places, and the author of a book called Noah's Garden. She started to do things differently in her landscape. She started to manage her landscape organically and use native plants, and she observed the changes that occurred. And number 3, Dr. Doug Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home, and Doug Tallamy himself. So I'll just tease you with that and tell you that I've got some interviews with him on my website, and please take a look at them, because what he has to say is very powerful. He's reconnecting us to the landscapes that we've kind of neglected. Now up here, you've got natural areas, right? So it's kind of easy to say, well, it doesn't matter because there's a lot of forest or woodland or meadow. But where I am, boy, does it matter what you do in your yard. Okay. So what in the heck are pollinators? Well, simply put, it's an animal, not always a bee, that moves pollen from the anthers to the stigma of a flower It could be the same flower or a different flower. That's as simple as it is. But it's not always a bee, and it's always mutualistic. There's an interconnection, an evolutionary interconnection sometimes between the pollinator and the plant. And I'd like to share with you what some of these pollinators are, because you're going to be surprised. Beetles. Does that surprise you? Anybody? Did anybody know that we have beetles who are pollinators? What's that flower? It's a magnolia flower. It's a very ancient form of plant with a very ancient form of pollinator, a beetle. Now, not all beetles are pollinators, right? But we have a lot that are critically important. In fact, they're the largest set of insects, pollinated animals, in North America. We have about 30,000 species of beetles here. And they're very important for food crops in the tropics, not so much here. And I'll share with you, you have two handouts, by the way. One of them is this. This is my Pollinator Victory Garden handout, and I've got two sides. One is some tips, and the other are these aspects of plants by type of pollinator. So you don't have to memorize this stuff or take notes. You can take it home. Well, what do beetles like? Well, beetles like colors that are typically dull, white, greenish, often bowl-shaped, like the magnolias, with a strong, fruity, sometimes a bit stinky smell, usually with nectar. No nectar guides, and I'll show you what those are in a minute, and lots of pollen. That's what beetles like. So those are nectar guides. Now, we can often see nectar guides, but oftentimes we can't, because insects see differently than we do. So these visible patterns are what attract pollinators to the good stuff. They're kind of like little runways for the pollinators. Even dandelions have nectar guides, but we can't. They're not visible to humans. Now, beetle-pollinated plants would include things like magnolias, pawpaw, water lilies, jack-in-the-pulpit, and you'll note that a lot of plants have multiple types of animal pollinators. For example, goldenrods and asters attract tons of bees, but they also attract quite a few beetles as well. So there is some overlap in these plants and these animals. Oops, sorry, I'm a little fast on the trigger here. Bats are very important pollinators, particularly in the tropics, not so much here in North America, but we have 45 species of bats here, and a good number of them are in bad trouble. Have there been studies up here on bat decline? Yeah? Is it looking pretty?
Yeah, it's bad.
Yeah, it's bad. And some of this is man-introduced, unfortunately. I understand that spelunking, going into caves with tracking in things on your feet, has been really problematic, to say the least. 300 species of fruit actually depend on bat pollination. Not so much what we're growing, but what do bats look for? Well, they're looking for white, pale, greenish colored, or purple flowers, usually open at night because most bats are nocturnal, and with a very fragrant, often fruity smell, sometimes even on the fermenting side. Lots of nectar with no nectar guides, and lots of pollen. Those are characteristics of bat-pollinated plants. What would they include? Things like peaches and dates and figs, mangoes, bananas, guavas, a lot of things that we don't grow here, but important in the grocery store for sure. Now, how about flies? You're like, really? Yeah, I'm not talking about the common housefly, but we have a number of species of pollinating flies. I'm not going to talk about them, but we actually have some species of pollinating mosquitoes, if you can believe that. But flies can be very important pollinators. They often look like bees or wasps, the ones that are pollinators, but they only have one pair of wings, so you can distinguish them rather easily. And some of them are really, really good at it, like this guy. Have you ever seen a little syrphid fly hovering over your typically small-petaled flowers? You go, oh, look at that little bee. Well, it's probably a syrphid fly. And what do they like? Well, they typically, not always, but typically like colors of flowers that are dark brown or purple or pale, different shapes of flowers with a stinky smell. Putrid, rotting flesh. Ooh. Nectar is usually absent, and there is some pollen. So fly-pollinated plants would include things like, I bet you know skunk cabbage from your woods, right? That comes up, that's a very early plant in the spring. It actually kind of heats up the snow around it and melts it a little bit, and the flies can find it. Junk in the pulpit, also fly-pollinated dogbane in the milkweed family, and interestingly, red trillium, but not the other species of trilliums. I can't explain that to you, but there you go. Pawpaw again. We were talking last night about whether pawpaw is hardy here, and it's hardy to zone 5. What zone are we in right here? 3? 3? So don't try pawpaw here. But it's a really cool native plant that produces our largest edible fruit. Dutchman's pipe is a beautiful native vine with big heart-shaped leaves. That's also fly-pollinated. And then, of course, butterflies are pollinators that we've kind of taken for granted a little bit because we've said, well, you know, they don't have very much contact with the pollen. They're not particularly effective pollinators. But then things come up. Science tells us things that maybe we didn't know before when somebody does a research study. I wish there were more of these research studies going on because we'd learn so much more. But in 2015, some research from NC State discovered that swallowtail butterflies are the absolute best pollinators of this plant, Rhododendron calendulaceum, a type of native azalea. It's a flame azalea. There's one that I love at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden where I teach. And why is that? Well, swallowtails do something called wing pollination. They flap their wings when they're nectaring, and so they release pollen from the flowers when they do that. Not all butterflies pollinate like that. So they go onto this flower, the next plant with the next flower, and they're spreading pollen as they go. So I'd like to just say that, you know, we don't know what we don't know. There are lots of things out there that are happening that we kind of take for granted. Evolution is makes a very strong case for using native plants, because sometimes we just don't know. Now, butterfly pollinated plants are typically kind of bright in color, often red, orange, yellow, etc., sometimes purple. They typically have a wide landing pad, but not always. Things like blazing star, for example, a spiked blazing star doesn't have a landing pad. And a slight odor, usually have nectar guides, not always, lots of nectar and limited pollen. So they would include things like milkweeds. Milkweed is not just a host plant. Now, does everybody know what a host plant is? Don't be shy if you don't. Anybody? Okay, well, let me tell you what a host plant is. So we really haven't thought about this very much until perhaps the last 10 years when the monarch crisis hit. And all of a sudden, we're talking about the fact that monarch caterpillars need milkweed plants. It's the host plant that they've evolved with. The vast, vast majority of our butterfly caterpillars eat plant leaves. They don't eat nectar like their adult counterparts do. And so I tell people, if you want a great book on butterfly gardening, the one that you get, everybody write this down, is David Wagner's book, Caterpillars of Eastern North America. You're like, what? Well, of course, because you can see where butterflies nectar. What you can't always see is where their caterpillars are eating. So making sure that you have host plants in your landscape, and oftentimes these are woody plants, trees and shrubs, not always, that's really just as important as having these floral resources. And milkweeds function not only as a host plant for monarchs, but also as nectar plant for many, many, many invertebrates. So pieweeds are great, coneflowers, sunflowers, ironweeds, Liatris blazing star. These are all really good butterfly plants. And then we have wasps that are pollinators. This is where people start to say, really? Yeah. Wasps are important, and most of them don't sting, by the way. 90% of our wasp species in North America are actually solitary. They're not the ones that we tend to fear, like the paper wasps that are, you know, they go into colonies. Most of them are just solitary little creatures. They're mainly predators, and they're highly beneficial in our ecosystems. So give wasps some love. The adults will visit flowers to get some nectar when they're really hungry. You're shaking your head. You're not into the... Okay, well, you know, try. They have short tongues, so they need kind of more open flowers than some other pollinators might. And they like a lot of butterfly plants. Here's another gardening tip. If you haven't planted mountain mints, our native pycnanthemum species, take a look at them, because they are unbelievable pollinator plants. Anybody have a mountain mint? 1, 2. So all the rest of you, you know, you can start buying these amazing plants. And if you have a deer browse issue, I'm sure you probably all do, deer browse issues in your landscape, you're looking for plants that have some deer resistance. And there you go, very much so. So take a look at pycnanthemums, mountain mints. Moths can be very good pollinators too. This is one of the most charismatic moths that comes out during the day. Who knows what this is? No ringer. What is that? What's the moth? Clearwing, hummingbird moth, we also call it, because when you see it, you think, what is that thing? Is that a moth? It's too small to be a hummingbird, but it flies like a hummingbird. It's the coolest thing. Great way to engage kids, by the way, to point these little critters out. And this is unusual because most moths, of course, are nocturnal. They're out at night. The way that they nectar, some land on flowers, some hover, kind of depends. And we can typically, if we kind of make this simplistic, we can tell the difference between butterflies and moths because moths are typically duller in color and plumpier and hairier. But of course, there are exceptions because our skippers aren't typically very showy and they're butterflies. Now, what do moth pollinated plants look like? Well, oftentimes they're pale, white, pink, red, purple, clusters of flowers, sometimes landing pads, often with a strong and sweet odor at night to attract those nocturnal moths. No nectar guides, lots of nectar, and limited pollen. And those things would include things like primrose, Liatris, the blazing star, our native yucca, gardenia, jasmine, morning glory, all of these are pollinated by moths. Again, there's some duplication of pollinators on a lot of these plants. And then, of course, we have birds. So your next challenge, what's the bird, what's the plant? Hummingbird, and what's the plant? Cardinal flower, Lobelia cardinalis. Anybody grow that one? So it's great to start trying some of these things to see how they grow. And what you'll learn with cardinal flower is it wants to grow where it wants to grow. Have you noticed that? You put it here, it winds up there. Often the seed is carried by water, and it likes moist soil. If it gets too dry, the basal rosette, the bottom leaves, will dry up and not persist over winter. And if you see no basal leaves over winter, you're done. You put it in the wrong place. But some of our native plants have this kind of pattern where they reproduce from seed and they kind of choose where they want to live. Our native columbine is very much like that as well. And that's okay. You just know that before you plant it. Oops. So bird pollinators, we actually have 53 species of birds in North America that drink nectar, not just hummingbirds. And oriole, yellow-bellied sapsucker, scarlet tanager, these are just some of the 53 species. And they typically like scarlet red flowers, they like orange flowers, white flowers with large funnels. They typically have longer tongues, no odor, no nectar guides, a lot of nectar and some pollen. So our bird-pollinated plants would include things like cardinal flower we talked about, and truly one of my all-time favorite plants, I talked about this last night, trumpet honeysuckle. Do you guys know this one? Yeah, do you have this one? So this is a wonderful vine. You know, give it support. I've seen it grown once as a shrub. I don't know how they managed to make it look good, but they did. But it really needs support on a fence or something like that, at the side of a wall. And it has one of the longest bloom times of any of our native plants, from spring through fall. And like many native plants, it does more than one thing well. Sure, hummingbirds love to nectar in those tubular flowers, but this is also a host plant. Its leaves are eaten by some of our butterfly caterpillars. And then it provides that wonderful nectar, and then it produces fruit in the late summer or early fall that's super important for migrating birds. There's another tip for you. You don't have to just think about pollinators tonight. Think about how many more birds we're getting that are overwintering that used to migrate. I don't know what you see here, but where I am, I mean, the robins are not getting the memo that it's time to go. They're hanging out. So what does that mean? Well, a couple things. First of all, for the ones that decide to migrate, let's make sure they get the right fuel to make that trip. Our native plants that produce this kind of perfect nutrition package for fruit-eating migrators. But for the ones that overwinter, let's think about gardening with plants that have persistent fruit. The desperation food that birds need who are overwintering, and again, are fruit eaters. Things like, I'll bet you know, give me an idea. What's a plant, maybe in your garden or friend's garden, that has persistent fruit in the winter? You still see it on the plant in the winter. High bush cranberry, yep. Anybody else? Mountain ash, yeah. Eastern red cedar, right, with the juniper, right, the fruits. Northern bayberry, our native ilex, I'm sorry, who's saying? Winterberry, exactly, our native ilexes, our hollies, winterberry, inkberry. Think about starting to introduce more of these plants in your landscape as climate change is facing us and birds, you know, are kind of confused about where to go and when to go. And so providing them with more resources in your landscape is a really great idea. Other bird-pollinated plants would include trumpet creeper, and this I'll just make a comment. Know how a plant grows or have some idea. Do a little research before you plant it. Because if you plant trumpet creeper, anybody got it? It's a bit of a beast. I call these frisky. I never call a native and indigenous plant invasive because that's really reserved for plants that don't belong here. But it's a very frisky plant, whereas trumpet honeysuckle is much better behaved. So know a plant's growth pattern before you plant it so you're not disappointed. Now bee balm, Monarda didyma, that wonderful red flowered plant you probably know, I hear some people say, oh, that's so invasive. No, 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 no. It's a runner. Plants are pretty much in two categories. They're clumpers and they're runners. Know what it is before you put it in your landscape. Let it play nicely with other plants that have a similar growth characteristic. And then, of course, we have jewelweed, which I think is a tremendously underutilized landscape plant. It's an annual, but it's such a great annual. And, of course, it's a hummingbird attractor. And it does create that lovely salve that we can use when we get the poison ivy on us. And then columbine, Aquilegia canadensis, our first flowering native plant in the spring for hummingbirds. Anybody got those? Yeah, they're great, aren't they? That's a plant. You put it here, it goes there. And then, of course, we have the bees, which most people think that pollinators are exactly the same thing as bees, but, you know, they're a subset. So they like bright white, they like yellow, they like blue, they like purple. They see on a UV spectrum. They don't see red. Nectar guides are typically present, mild fragrant odor that we wouldn't perhaps notice. Nectar usually present, but not always. Plants like our native roses have no nectar at all, only pollen. St. John's wort has pollen only, no nectar. And they can be very valuable to bees at a time of year when they need it. And the flower shapes are all over the map, and I'll explain why. So a little bee background for you. Oops, so sorry, this is not my clicker, and I'm not used to it. So this is the European honeybee. Do we have any beekeepers with us? One? And here. So they're an introduced species. They were brought here in 1622 to Jamestown, Virginia by the colonists who thought, well, what are we going to need when we make the trip? So they thought, okay, we need mastiffs. I'm not kidding. They brought mastiffs. They brought peacocks. They brought a lot of European weeds. They brought honeybees because they kind of knew how valuable they were for pollination, for honey, for propolis, for wax. They're not native to the U.S. They're referred to as the European honeybee, but actually they're thought to have originated in Africa and migrated to Europe. They're the only insect that makes enough honey for us to use. And boy, we love honey, don't we? A honeybee worker has to work awfully hard to produce honey. In her lifetime, she might make a 12th to a 10th teaspoon of honey. That's it. They work really, really hard. They could make 50 forage trips a day when they're active. They're very useful, as I said, for beeswax, plant pollination, particularly in commercial ventures. And that's unfortunate the way that honeybees are treated commercially. And then, of course, for the stuff that they collect from resinous trees called propolis, the sticky goo, that they use as an antiseptic and a structural element in their hive. And we figured out that that propolis is actually really great as an antiseptic, as a tincture form for mouth sores or a skin sore, something like that. So if you go to a local farmer's market and there's a beekeeper, chances are they might be offering propolis for sale. They're social in a big way. A healthy colony might be 50,000 individuals or even more than that. And they're forage generalists. They use a lot of different plants, including a lot of our native plants. So I actually teach beekeepers how to use native plants to support their honeybees and to support the environment, which I think is a little clever of me. How are they doing? Well, this was recently released. This is data from the Bee Informed Partnership. They work in collaboration with the USDA. My beekeeper friend, have you seen this report? Have you seen this, sir? No? Okay. So this is how they did over winter 2017. So backyard beekeepers report a 45% loss. That's big. That's big. Sideline beekeepers, folks with 51 colonies to 500 colonies, reported a 37% loss. And commercial beekeepers, those with 500 colonies, over 500 colonies, reported a 25% loss. Now, I'll share with you that typically a beekeeper, commercial beekeeper especially, will say 18–19% is a tolerable loss rate over winter. Would you agree with that, sir? I don't know how many bees you have. Okay, so you definitely don't want to lose, like, you don't want to lose any of them. So this isn't really great news. And how does it compare to, oh lordy, sorry. Okay, so how does it compare to the previous year? Well, for backyard beekeepers in 2017, 45% loss versus 37.9, 38%. So it's actually gotten worse for backyard beekeepers. Sideline beekeepers, also worse. Commercial, right on the money, equivalent number, which I think is very strange, year to year. But what we're seeing is summer losses are getting really bad too. So historically, since they've been doing this survey, this is kind of what the data looks like. And it bounces around a bit, but I mean, look at do you see any numbers that look like 18 or 19? No. So we're well beyond what a tolerable loss is. So what does that mean? Well, even if you are not a beekeeper like my friend here, you can help plant for his bees and native bees by really increasing the floral resources in your landscape. And you can do his bees and all those native bees a favor by not using any pesticides, organic or otherwise. You know, we often have thought of organic being this word that means benign, but that's not true. Spinosad, an organic preparation, can be just as lethal to a sensitive bee as a synthetic pesticide. So let's start thinking differently about managing pests. Let's start thinking about introducing plants, native plants in our landscapes that attract beneficial insects that are natural enemies. And I'll bet you know one. What can you think of? What insect can you think of that eats a ton of aphids? Ladybugs, right? So instead of thinking, oh, I've got a spray, I've got a problem, we start to think about keeping a natural balance, not eradicating any particular insects, but keeping a natural balance. And we start bringing in plants that are small flowered, like those pycnanthemums that they really, really like, to support those beneficial insects with the pollen that they need in their life cycle. So if you're interested in that topic, please visit my website and listen to my interviews with Dr. Doug Landis and a couple other folks on this topic. Very important one. We've got a lot of native bees, guys. And most folks probably couldn't name more than maybe 2 or 3 species, but we got a lot. In North America, we've got about 4, excuse me, did I just go over that? Oop. Okay, in North America, we've got about 4,000 species of native bees. In New York State, depending on, again, who you ask, somewhere between 400 and 450 species of native bees. Even in New York City, we got over 100 species of native bees. Hard to believe when you go to the city and go, where are these poor things going? And we have such an abundance of beekeepers now, but we're not always thinking about where are the floral resources for the bees that we're keeping. To me, if you have a cat or a dog, you don't expect somebody else to feed them, do you? Same thing with keeping bees. If you can't supply the forage in your own landscape, get your neighbors, get your friends around you to start planting to help your bees. Did I just lose the, okay, here we go. So in terms of what they eat, most of our native bees, 80% of them are generalists. They can eat nectar and pollen from many different plants. But about 20% are specialists. They've evolved with particular plants that they must have. And that's important from a gardening perspective, and I'll talk more about that. Different native bees emerge at different times of year. March 1 doesn't come around and everybody says, okay, it's time. So they come in kind of gradually. Some of those bumblebees are the toughest ones that come out earliest. And they have different body shapes, body strengths, body sizes, and tongue lengths that help determine what flowers they can use. Now, 90% of our native bees are solitary, making them extremely different from the European honeybee. And that also has implications for how we garden. And I'll talk about nesting sites in a sec. There are some bee species that are social, but in a very, very limited way. Bumblebees are what are called eusocial. The mothers and daughters nest together in a group of maybe 200. That's a very small group compared to, honeybees. So think about where they want to live. Vast majority, 70%, are ground nesters. When you are gardening, think about habitat. Where can I provide these ground nesting bees with habitat? Well, that's going to be typically in full sun in bare soil. Now, that maybe is not the most exciting message for the day, leave some bare soil in full sun, but get excited when you do that, because you'll start to see those little nests, the little mounds of dirt, and you know that you're not only feeding them, you're giving them a place to live, pesticide-free. You don't have to do it right outside the front door or the back door, but find a place in your landscape where they can live. Cavity nesters, 30% of our native bee species. And where do they go? They'll go to old mouse holes, they'll go to old beetle burrows, they'll go to holes in wood, and they'll go to hollow plant stems. So another practice for gardening. In the fall, don't be a neatnik. My mother had a nickname for me. She called me Nellie Neat. I've taken a lifetime to get past that. I'm no longer Nellie Neat. And I leave my perennials and my flowering perennials and my grasses standing through winter because I know that is habitat for some of these creatures. Sometimes these pithy stems, like a Joe Pye weed, might hold a little bee that is overwintering alive. Most bees, of course, die in the fall. But keep that habitat for them and then cut your perennials back in early spring. Not too early. You want to make sure that the ground's not too mucky and moist because you'll compact the soil. And if you have a large landscape, think about alternating when you're cutting back. Don't do it all the same week, because maybe not everybody's woken up yet, and maybe some cold weather's coming. So just think about these things in terms of the habitat. Now, some native bees are really great pollinators, and they don't get their due, like these. Anybody have an apple orchard? I had somebody last night who had a bunch of apple trees. Well, this is our blue orchard mason bee, a native bee that is the most efficient pollinator of apples. And it is said that 100 individual orchard mason bees can do the same pollination of a 1-acre apple orchard that it takes your entire colony to do. That's pretty amazing. You think we need more of these? Absolutely. We don't want to, yes? Yeah, blue orchard mason bee, yeah, same thing, yeah. And so we don't want to become like Japan. I remember seeing this really terrifying show on PBS some years ago. I don't know if you guys saw it, where they had human beings out with feathers pollinating fruit, going from one plant. Can you imagine how much that would cost? Well, has anybody been to Japan? I mean, they're really big on ornamental fruits. You can go to, the basement of a department store. Have you been to one of these places? And you can buy like a $100 apple. It's like the perfect apple. Okay, well, that's one thing. But I don't want to be paying $100 for every apple that I eat because somebody's had to hand pollinate it. We need to really think about these connections and share these connections with our kids so they appreciate it and they protect creatures like this. Oh, sorry, it beat you to the punch there. Our native bumblebee, an extremely important critter for things like blueberries. And I know you got some blueberries up here because I saw some outside. So why are they so important? Well, they have evolved with the plants, the blueberry plants, Vaccinium species, in such a way that they have this behavior called buzz pollination. They go up into the flower of the plant, they vibrate their bodies, they release the pollen, they go to the next flower, the next plant, and they do an incredible job. And other bees don't do this. So like honeybees can't do that. So when we think about this, we think about, okay, cross-pollination, That makes a lot of sense. But in the case of blueberries and some other plants like our native viburnums, we really need to have genetically different plants in our gardens, in this case blueberries, to provide the best cross-pollination. So who's growing blueberries? Okay, a couple people. So when you go buy them, think about getting, you know, a plant from maybe this nursery and then maybe a plant from that nursery, or if you see a named cultivar, one that's a straight species, one that's a named cultivar. But that cross-pollination is really important. I have so many people tell me, I'm not getting any fruit on my blueberries or my viburnums. Why is that? Because you need a genetically different plant that the bees can go to and do their work. Oh, Lord, sorry. So anyway, you've seen this 3 times now. So you are really not just a pretty face. Don't let this happen to you. You're a pollinator steward. That's what I'm making you today. Think of yourselves as gardeners and pollinator stewards. And some things that we can do, some basic things, are plant for species diversity. I just showed you all those different types of pollinators. Even just within the bee group, we have all these different creatures. Think diversely. Choose a diverse array of plants. So what I say is plant diversely, but plant sufficiently. It helps to have pollinator targets. The plant sale that you've just had, I hope nobody was buying like one of each perennial. That's really not a great practice. We want to buy a few of each species, especially when we're talking about herbaceous plants, not woody plants. And that can be planted in your garden either as like a floral target, or if they're particularly tasty plants for deer, we can think about mimicking meadows where we have an erratic bloom throughout the garden. So it's harder for the deer just to come in and say, lunch. So think about planting different flower color, shapes, and sizes in your garden. Offer a succession of blooms, super important, from early spring, a lot of those native woody plants, all the way to fall. Who can tell me a really important fall blooming native plant for pollinators? Asters, goldenrods, yeah, you've got them naturally occurring here. I mean, you've got lupin in the parking lot. I would kill to have lupin in my parking lot. And we need to provide pesticide-free forage. I'll just say it. A pollinator garden is pesticide-free, period. No ifs, ands, buts, or maybes. It's pesticide-free. You can't do it any other way, guys. We got to learn to tolerate a little bit of damage. Sometimes we might see damage on a leaf. For example, sometimes I'll see on oak leaves kind of just like this circular cut in the leaf. Have you ever noticed that on roses or oak leaves kind of early in the season? And I get really excited when I see that. I know I'm strange. Why do I get excited? Because I know that's a leaf cutter bee, that she's taking just the material she needs from that leaf to line her nest, to support her larval brood. That's what she's doing. And I know it's a cycle of nature. So sometimes we think it's damage when it's actually nature just doing its thing. And we need to provide habitat, not just forage, right? So what do we need? We need pollen for protein, the essential ingredient for developing the offspring, and then we need nectar for energy for pollinators, 2 different things. And we can provide a variety of forage resources, just like we don't eat the same thing every day. Well, we don't want our bees to eat that either. So let's talk about flowers a little bit. Well, the mouth parts of a pollinator kind of dictate what they can access. That little thing sticking out is a proboscis. So that is the bee's tongue. And when it's not in use, it flips it over the back of its head. It's kind of cool. And tucks it away. But when it's nectaring, it's trying to figure out, can I get that nectar in that flower? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes no. Honeybees have mid-length tongues. Bumblebees a little bit longer tongues. Some bees have really long tongues. Hummingbirds have really long tongues. And here's some examples of common plants and how long the tubes are in those flower parts. So like borage, you probably all know borage. It's an herb, not a native. It's very easily accessed by many different pollinators. White clover, okay, still pretty accessible. Then we get into lavender, okay, not so much. And then viper's bloodgloss, okay, a little harder. But when we get to the larkspurs, boy, if you don't have a super long tongue, you are not getting in there. This is native to the mid-Atlantic, primarily in the southeast. Dwarf Larkspur, it's an ephemeral. It comes up in the spring and dies back in the summer. I'll talk about that in a sec. But if you don't have a long tongue, you're not getting in there. But you might be a smart bee, and you might think, well, if I bit the base of that flower, I could steal the nectar. And sometimes bees do that. They nectar rob. They don't pollinate when they do that, but I think that's kind of cool. It tells you how smart bees are. So what are you going to do? What do you need to know to create your Pollinator Victory Garden? Well, I want you to reduce the green desert. And I will even tell you where this picture was taken. I'm active with the Garden Writers Association, and they have an annual conference, and we get to see people's gardens, people that, you know, normally you don't get to see their gardens. So this is, don't tell anybody, Arthur Blank, the co-founder of Home Depot. This is his garden in Atlanta with that big old perfect green desert. Not so good. So how do we start reducing it? Because honestly, you know, we might be using it for kid play, or, you know, kids playing out there, or dogs going out there, or we might picnic on it. Keep what you really truly use. Lose the rest. But whatever you keep, manage it organically. So if we want to start reducing it, we can think about creating pollinator islands within the green desert. We can think about expanding the foundation plantings, pulling the plant bed line out, or looking at our woodland edge and pulling it forward, creating those layers so important in nature. These are the things that we can start to do. My tip for you is make it easy enough that you do it. Don't get overwhelmed and say, oh my God, what am I going to do? I've got so much to do. No, make it easy. Put a pollinator island in the middle. See how fabulous it is. And then, you know, maybe next year you do another one and another one. It's just so much more satisfying than being overwhelmed. We want to plant a succession of bloom from early spring, all right, including things like those pussy willows I told you about and the red maples. Oops, I'm sorry, through late fall in my own garden, one of our native asters. Oh, Lord. We want to have full sun for most bee plants, but there are exceptions, like this whitewood aster that you see in the woods around here. I'm sure you've got whitewood aster, yes? Yeah, it's very common. This is an important resource for bees, and it's in the shade typically, but they find it because they need it that time of year. And favor native plants. You don't have to use only native plants, but I would really like it if you did. I favor native plants. I emphasize them. I have some things in my garden that predate my conversion, as it were, right? So I have a lilac I really love. I have an Anchianthus I really love. I allow myself to have some pleasures, some floral pleasures in my landscape, but I understand there's a difference in terms of what they deliver in an ecosystem. They're for me. They're not so much for them. So please do favor the native plants that have those evolutionary interconnections. We create greater biodiversity, super important in times of climate change, and improve wildlife value, and we respect evolution when we use natives. Here's an example of that evolutionary process. So this little flower is Spring Beauty. I think I saw in one of the cases here, one of those wonderful recreations of wildflowers. I think there's a Spring Beauty in there. And this is a tiny little plant. It's got kind of grassy-like little leaves, and it's got these wonderful pink and white stripes, those Nectar Guides. So it's an ephemeral, and you probably have seen ephemerals like trilliums. So they come up in the spring before the trees leaf out when the soil is still pretty moist. And they come up and they feed the creatures that depend upon them, and then they die back in the summer and they kind of just vanish. Are you familiar with some of these? Does anybody know like an example of one other than this? Trilliums? Trout lilies? Anybody else? Wild leeks. There are all sorts of ones that we kind of see them out there in the woods perhaps, but we don't necessarily include them in our gardens. And particularly where I am, we really need to start using them in, you know, cultivated landscapes. And I would argue that they're actually very, very beautiful too. But this Spring Beauty is the necessary plant, necessary nectar source for this Indrenid bee, this mining bee. They've evolved together. It's a specialist bee. Without the plant, there's no bee. Without the bee, there's no plant. And if we don't start planting these specialist plants, we lose both species. Bumblebee, again, evolution at work, buzz pollination. And even this, our wild geranium, you probably have seen in the woodlands. This is also a plant for specialist bee. Here's another one, Dutchman's breeches. Are these looking familiar? Yes, very important for bumblebees. And this one looks very much like the other one that I missed. Okay, sorry. And then we can also think about plants that maybe didn't occur to us. In my case, and I got to check the hardiness on this, but this is a northeastern native. Do you know that? This is a prickly pear cactus. It's hardy where I am. I'm trying to find out if it's hardy where you are. And nobody would think to plant this, right? But I'll tell you what, it's a bee magnet. Where does it want to live? It wants to live in a hot, dry, preferably kind of rocky environment, and it puts on a flower show that's spectacular and attracts a lot of bees. Plus, it's edible. The prickly pears are edible, the pads are edible. Admittedly, you got to do a lot of work to get those spines off. Be careful with that. We want to choose straight species plants, and I'll show you what I mean by that. That's our first choice, the plants as they occur in nature. If we're going to use cultivars or selections, when you go buy a plant, did you have only straight species, by the way, or did you have any cultivars in your sale? Okay, there you go. So say you're looking for a plant, and we'll just use coneflower because that's a really easy one that people know. So its name is Echinacea purpurea, and it's not native here specifically, but it's native in the United States. So Echinacea purpurea is its name for the straight species, and when you see another name following that with single quotes, Echinacea purpurea, say Magnus with single quotes, that's a cultivar, that's a selection. That's something that some human being has said, yes, I want to cultivate that. And sometimes we lose a lot of genetic diversity depending on how that plant is grown. So sticking with the natural forms of plants is very important. We want to avoid overly hybridized plants that have often little or nectar, little to no nectar, or pollen, or seed. And that includes double-flowered plants. So here's here's an example. This is Echinacea purpurea we talked about. Single quotes, the selection is called Pink Double Delight. This is how the real straight species looks. What's missing there? The cone, right? It's been bred, so the cone has been replaced by petals. And where's all the nectar and the pollen and then the seed for birds? In the cone. So if it really looks awfully different, the plant that you're considering buying, then the straight species plant, I just say avoid it, for ecological reasons. If you want to just enjoy it for yourself, that's up to you. But different ecological services include flowering trees and shrubs, our pussy willow, as I mentioned before. Plant diversely, but provide sizable floral targets, either in the form of a mass. We could do maybe a 4x4 target would be a really nice healthy mass of one perennial, or we can look at a meadowscape alternative. This is what I call kind of gardening with a meadow in mind. You don't have to have 2 acres to have a meadow. You can do a little slice of a meadow in your own landscape. That repetition of bloom, many pollinators find very easily because some pollinators have a behavior called floral constancy, like your honeybees. When they go out on a foraging mission, they're looking for a specific species of plant. And they'll go to like penstemon, and then come back and then go for like another species. They'll find it if you plant this way. It's a great way to plant and makes for a more deer-resistant garden too. That repetition of bloom. It's harder for deer just to go chomping away when you do this. We need to provide diverse habitats, specifically some bare soil or lightly vegetated soil in full sun for those ground nesters. We can even do some man-made habitats if we like, but do a little homework on this because different bees like different kinds of cavities and different sizes, and we have to clean them, and sometimes they're taken over by other creatures. Interesting interview with John Hayden about that. Avoid using those pesticides, fungicides, and herbicides. Collectively in the trade, we talk about pesticides, but that includes all of these things. And gosh, add a pollinator habitat sign to your garden. Do you know the Xerces Society? If you don't, please look them up. To me, they really are the #1 advocate, nonprofit advocate for invertebrates in North America. And I got really excited today because I got an email I have a friend who started Bee City USA in Asheville, North Carolina, and they have just merged with the Xerces Society. So now, remember the tree cities that we started to do in North America? We're doing bee cities now, and there are quite a few cities, hint, hint, that are designated this way. So by having a sign like this, we're basically telling the world we're doing something a little different in our gardens than normal. There's a reason that we leave our perennials standing through winter. There's a reason we have all these native plants. And I think it's very effective. We call it a cue to care. Research was done a number of years ago that showed that naturalistic plantings with native plants were more accepted by average people who didn't know what the heck they were when there were some kind of cues to them that we, the gardeners, are caring for the environment or caring for our landscape, that we just haven't kind of lost our senses and forgotten to take our plants down in the winter, for example. And this can include things like a hardscaped edge, or if you have a meadowscape, mowing a path through it, a cue that you're actually tending that landscape. So, plant selection summary, we're going to have diverse plantings, including woodies, trees, and shrubs, floral targets, or repetition of bloom, different flower structures, colors, and sizes, and of course, succession of bloom. And if we plant this way, we not only create happy pollinators, but we create a happy planet. So I thank you so much for your time, and thank you for coming, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you. This, by the way, this is in my garden. Any questions, folks?